Hello, my name is Omid, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to share some thoughts with our beloved community of the Inayatiyya about responding to white supremacy, racism, and colonialism in this world in which we all share. It would be understandable if some people were to ask us, what does a spiritual community have to do with these very political and divisive issues? I would invite us to begin with a reflection on the 10 principal Sufi thoughts of Pir Murshid Hazrat Inayat Khan. Pir Murshid says, there is one law, the law of reciprocity, which can be observed by a selfless conscience together with a sense of awakened justice. There's one law, the law of reciprocity. So therefore, a system and an institution which violates that ethic of reciprocity and instead puts in an oppressive hierarchy of unmerited oppression, of placing some over others, would violate that law of reciprocity. Pir Murshid goes on to say there is one brotherhood and sisterhood, the human brotherhood and sisterhood, which unites the children of earth indiscriminately in the parenthood of God. Indiscriminately. The systems of tyranny and oppression which are designed to discriminate, putting some brothers and sisters over and above others, would run against this teaching of Murshid as well. Let me just launch us into this conversation by reminding us that in the prayer Salat, we call on the Messenger, Christ, Nabi, and the Rasul of God, whose heart constantly reaches upward, who cometh on earth with a message as a dove from above when Dharma decays. When Dharma decays. And a world in which racism and colonialism and injustice are running amok is a world in which Dharma is decaying. May it be that this new consciousness rises among us so that we can come to see the message of spiritual liberty, which has always been our calling, as something that connects that message of spiritual liberty to the bodies, hearts, and souls of God's children. We cannot be caring only for the hearts and souls if those bodies are living in oppression. So what I want to do is I want to take a few minutes of our time and give us a global look at this conversation about racism and colonialism. And I'm going to begin by taking us to a place that is no doubt familiar to many of us. Martin Luther King, but perhaps not the Martin Luther King that we have always heard. This clip is going to start out with that ever so familiar voice of Dr. King. But where he goes is, I'm willing to bet, is a place that many of us have not heard.
But by the content of their character, I have a dream today.
This much we have heard.
I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months, I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments, and I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go.
So this is a Martin that we don't hear so often, the one who acknowledges that the eloquent voice of the dream that he had had has in many ways turned into a nightmare. Of course, there have always been other voices, Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, the eloquent and powerful, charismatic Muslim prince of Black America, who always said that Black people have not experienced America as a dream, but rather as a nightmare, that the promise of the American dream had remained ever so elusive for the majority of Black folk. If we see on our streets in the protest today the voice of discontent, this is the voice that we are hearing. The many people for whom the promise of the American dream has never been fulfilled, and instead they experience it as far too long a nightmare. There's a fundamental irony and contradiction that we want to sit with. And we hear this even in the voice of our own community. On one hand, we have many of us who aspire towards the universal and all-encompassing and all-embracing vision of the Sufi tradition and of Murshid. And we also have to hold room for the fact that pain and suffering are not evenly distributed in our world. That contradiction, which is somehow embedded in our discussion about universalism, goes back also to our founding fathers. So you have Thomas Jefferson, who is the primary person who writes the eloquent plea for the recognition of the fact that all men are created with inalienable rights. It's a powerful insight in the evolution of humanity. Is the very same person who owns slaves and sells even his own children who come to birth through his relationships with Black women into slavery. So if you go to the Museum of African American History and Culture, you can see the children's shackles from the Thomas Jefferson plantation. Right? This is a fundamental tension between the universalist aspirations of America that even before there was an America has always included slavery, injustice and oppression against Black people. One of the ways in which we see the inconsistency of the American experience is that the very same people who signed the Declaration of Independence in the year 1790 write the first naturalization law in which they limit the notion of citizenship to free white persons. Citizenship and whiteness become coterminous with one another, right? So it's a good idea, it's a good indication that our founding fathers, who were anti-colonial, champions of freedom, standing up for human rights against the British, in some ways also perpetuated white privilege. We know that they didn't see Black human beings as full human beings, and we see this in the 3/5 discussions and negotiations that this country has. Now, If we zoom back to a little bit more global conversation, you begin to see that the 19th century, shortly after the American Revolution, is a time in which European countries begin to dominate the majority of the world through the global process of colonialism. Asia, Africa, Latin America, Australia, these become English and French and Spanish and Portuguese and Italian colonies. Right? At one point, 85% of the known world is under the yoke of European colonialism. There is a competition among these European powers to carve the world. If we're wondering why it is that Europe and North America end up being so privileged, so wealthy, well, some of it has to do with industrial revolution. Some of it has to do with the spirit of ingenuity. But a lot of it also has to do with stolen land and stolen lives and stolen labor and stolen spirit. There's also a tremendous element of racism involved in this. If you look at the way that the language of colonialism presented itself, it wasn't just, we're going to come and dominate you and steal your resources. It is Lady Liberty bringing the flag of civilization, of science and learning, and having to step over these cartoonish and offensive depictions of the dark-skinned savage. Other cartoons from the same time period, today we would recognize them as horribly racist. As the white man carrying the dark-skinned savage up the hill of progress to the promised land of the school, right? We see how hurtful and offensive these are, but this is what was published readily in American newspapers, this one from Detroit. And of course, it's the transatlantic slavery, the time where perhaps 12.5 million human beings from the West African region are stolen and enslaved and brought over to the Americas. The vast majority are taken over to Latin America and Central America. About 10% make it to the United States. There's a little map here which goes to show you a progression of the slave ships where enslaved human beings are coming, and every dot represents one of these slave ships. You can imagine the horror, the pain, the suffering, the approximately 2.5 million human beings who never make it over to the New World, their bodies tossed overboard, lying at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. We as Americans have this blood on our hands. Before there is a United States of America, we are entangled in this global process of enslavement. The human beings who come on these slave ships are stripped of their language, stripped of their culture, stripped of their dignity, and their children become part of this racialized process of enslavement in America. The fate of Black folk in America ultimately goes back to this horrific 400-year legacy of treatment of Black people. You can see the auction posters from the late 1700s and from the 1800s that talk about the sale of men, women, and children. Human beings as chattel, as property, as things as objects, right? These are all violations of that principle of reciprocity that Murshid was talking about. And here's one of the pictures that we might wish to sit with the pain and the suffering. This is an enslaved human named Gordon from Louisiana who is lashed and punished. The pain and the trauma of this enslavement lingers for generations, right down to our own age. And enslavement of African origin people is only one part of this process. There's also the genocide that is waged against the indigenous native people. So we have stolen land and stolen lives as two of the foundations that become entangled in the building of the United States of America. The dream and the nightmare are mixed together from the very beginning. Remember that we talked about how citizenship was something that was defined through the lens of whiteness? Well, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, there's an enormous discussion about who can become a citizen of this country. In 1917, the very years in which Peter Murshid is migrating based on his Murshid's counsel to unite the world through his music and through his Sufi teachings, the United States is passing something called the Asiatic Barred Zone, the immigration law of 1917, where virtually the whole of Asia is barred from citizenship because, in the language of the legal text of the time, we're trying to preserve the whiteness of America. We only want to let in enough black and brown and yellow skinned immigrants so that it doesn't disturb the whiteness of America. This is where I want to come back to the point that Pirzia made last week so powerfully. I look on the image that we have on the West. This is one of those images of Murshid that is so meaningful to me. To glance upon him is to remember God. And I also look at the image of a slightly younger Murshid. And I remember that we stand in the footsteps of a dark-skinned, brown, South Asian, Muslim, mystic, and musician from South Asia, who, based on the legal codes of the time, would have been likely prevented from becoming a citizen of this country. Again, we heard Pirzia talk last week about the ways in which even some of Murshid's followers may not have wanted him to marry a white woman. The way in which the racial politics of the time also become gendered shows up in the 1950s in the lynching of Emmett Till, here shown with his mama, Mammy. As a 14, 15-year-old boy who's accused of having whistled at a white woman and is brutally lynched and murdered by white terrorists. It is Mammy Till's courage at opening up her heart so that the whole world can see her pain and her suffering that launches the civil rights movement. Part of the question that we have to ask ourselves is it possible that the pain and the hurt that the whole world is expressing now because of the brutal lynching of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, will also launch a movement that will redeem the soul of America and cure us of this sin of racism? remember that in the early 1900s, the lynchings of Black people became a spectacle. White people would have picnics. They would make postcards and sign it and send it to their family and loved ones. Who were these people? Could they be some of our ancestors? What kind of racism is hidden still in our midst? How do we shine the light on it? This is a short little map of places around the country that you see lynchings having taken place in this country. We come back to the reminder of Malcolm, having talked about how America is experienced by its Black citizens as a nightmare. And when we think about the lynching of George Floyd at the hand of police officers, I want us to listen to a couple of minutes of something that Malcolm said almost 60 years ago, and you see how resonant it feels today.
Don't scare Negroes today with no badge or no white skin or no white sheet or no white anything else. The police the same way. They put their club upside your head and then turn around and accuse you of attacking them. Every case of police brutality against a Negro follows the same pattern. They attack you, bust you all upside your mouth, and then take you to court and charge you with assault. What kind of democracy is that? What kind of freedom is that? What kind of social or political system is it when a Black man has no voice in court, has nothing on his side other than what the white man chooses to give him? My brothers and sisters, we have to put a stop to this, and it will never be stopped until we stop it ourselves. They attack the victim, and then the criminal who attacked the victim accuses the victim of attacking him. Yes, sir. This is American justice. Yes, sir. That's right. This is American democracy. Yes, and those of you who are familiar with it know that in America, democracy is hypocrisy. Right. Now, if I'm wrong, put me in jail.
These are strong words, right? In America, democracy is hypocrisy. Until and unless we get to the point where every citizen actually receives the same treatment, then our democratic ideals are something that have not yet been realized, as Murshid said upon seeing the Statue of Liberty. Muhammad Ali, who was enamored of Murshid's teachings and memorized Murshid's poetry, also recognizes this. Remember that he refuses to go fight in the Vietnam War, and he loses his heavyweight championship belt at the time. As I come towards the end, I want to remind us of a few points that Dr. King, whom we elevate, and rightly so, and remember so fondly, remember that when he's sitting in jail in Birmingham and he writes a letter, he talks about the great disappointment that he has with what he calls the white moderates, the people who urge him to only pursue things through the path of gradualism. And he says that it's possible that it's the white moderates, more so than the KKK, that are the greatest obstacle to the liberation of Black people. By 1967, Dr. King has connected together the racism in America with America's warmongering abroad. He stands in Riverside Church and he says, I have come to this magnificent house of worship because my conscience no longer permits me to remain silent. And what does he say? This is a Martin that we hardly ever see in public.
And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
This is a Dr. King who by April 4th of 1967 says that it is the American government which has become the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Strong words from a powerful prophetic voice. Now, we find ourselves living in a presidency of a president who ran on a campaign to shut down immigration of Muslims to America. Remember, under this rubric, Pir Murshid would have probably not been allowed to enter the United States of America. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, we have this unprecedented rise in the number of hate groups, neo-Nazi, KKK, white supremacist organizations. And it's not just the South. It's everywhere in this country. But we're not without hope. We are a people who always remember that in our founding documents, we are told, we the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. Right? We're not perfect. We were not perfect in the age of enslavement. We were not perfect in the age of Jim Crow. We were not perfect in the age of the extermination of the indigenous people. But we can become more perfect. We can become just a little bit better. Forget about making America great again. Can we start by just trying to be good? Can we start by trying to be kind? Can we start by being just? And if we do so by establishing justice. I'm reminded of the words of Langston Hughes, who reminds us, America never was America to me. Right? The experience of Black people is that America never lived up to its lofty ideals, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. That we're going to keep pushing to establish this beloved community that we all want to live in. I will end with a reminder of another Sufi teacher, this one from the African continent, Omar Mukhtar, a Libyan who struggled against the Italian colonial forces. And I would urge us as a Sufi community to not shy away, to not hide from the injustices that we see all around us, inside ourselves, and yes, even within our own communities. But we have models, and we have exemplars, and we have teachers, and we have teachings. We have Murshid, and we have Pirzia. We have a lineage of illuminated masters, prophets and prophetesses that go all the way back to God. People who have embodied what it means to bring love out into public until we recognize it as justice. The Italians had been so brutal in their occupation of Libya, killing and slaughtering thousands. One day in one skirmish, the tide turned and the Libyan forces were able to capture a few Italian soldiers. The Libyans, who were mostly, by the way, Sufis of the Sanusiya order, most of them said, well, let's do to them as they had done to us, an eye for an eye. They had killed us, let us also kill a few of them to make an example. Omar Mukhtar, this chivalrous knight, this Sufi warrior for justice, stopped them. And his followers protested and they said, Master, they killed us. Why shouldn't we do that to them? And Omar Mukhtar's response was, they are not our teacher. We have our teachers. And we too, in the Inayatiyya order have our teachers. We know what it means to speak of universal brotherhood and sisterhood. And in order for us to get there, we begin by shining the light of God onto the places where there's the greatest pain. May we prove ourselves to be worthy successors to this lineage and to these teachings. Thank you for the gift of your time.